Well, thank you very much. I guess there's the mic. All right. Well, welcome to the talk. This talk is called Breaking the Broken Web. So I just should set a little bit of expectation. I guess it's a little cut off there at the top. I'm Getify online, Getify. You can find me anywhere that matters online at Getify. So if you have any kind of feedback or thoughts, or you just want to tell me that I'm crazy after what I'm about to tell you, that's totally great. I'd love for you to reach out and provide that sort of feedback. So definitely do so. So just expectation setting for this particular talk. A lot of people like to come and listen to me give super in-depth tech talks, and this is the opposite of that. There is a little bit of code that's shown, but only tangentially, and we're not actually talking about the code. It's only an illustration. So this is not a tech talk, and some of you may not even really know exactly what to expect from it. But this talk is designed to sort of challenge some presumptions, I think, that we have about the way the web is, the way the web should be, the way we have built the web. And I'm speaking from 17 years as a web practitioner. That experience, and many of those years, the first 13 or 14 of those years, I was in the same shoes as many of you, which is that I was a developer at consultancies and large and small companies and everywhere in between and in every stack possible. So the ideas that I'm trying to share today are not about one specific part, but something broader about what I'm observing about the way that we as practitioners are building the web. Before I get into that talk, though, I want to do something. This is something I'm doing at the beginning of all of my talks now. We have an issue with diversity in our industry. And if you don't believe that, you have to open your eyes. It is plain to see that we have issues. And diversity in and of itself can kind of feel almost like we're talking about people in a token sense. And I don't mean that. What I really mean is the inclusion nature of our industry. We are not doing enough to fix that. And I do not have any answers to any of those problems. But I do know that we're not talking about it enough and admitting it enough. So I'm going to start off declaring what I like to call privilege awareness for my own personal self. This is not to suggest that anyone else in this room may or may not fit into any of these categories. I am not trying to criticize anyone here. But I am simply taking the responsibility as a speaker to step up and say, we have to talk about this more. So I'm going to declare my privilege awareness. First of all, that I'm obviously male. And I have a daughter right now, and it's terrible to me to think that she may grow up to want to be part of an industry where someone's always going to be second-guessing her. And that's not acceptable. Obviously, you can tell I'm white, and I had a lot of privilege in that nobody ever second-guessed that maybe I didn't have enough experience or enough educational background. In fact, the assumption was the other way around. There were many times that people assumed way more of me than they should have assumed. And that's a privilege that I have. People that achieve the same things that I may achieve oftentimes have to work harder for that. And it's not fair, and we have to fix those things. It begins by talking about it. I'm educated. I did get a chance to go to college, and many people do not have that opportunity. And that is a huge privilege on my part. I'm heterosexual, and thankfully it is becoming less and less of a privilege, but it's completely unacceptable that people have to feel like them as a person is not accepted by our industry and the choices that they make in their lives. So that's unacceptable, and we need to be more inclusive about these things. I'm American, and especially speaking here in Canada, that may sound like a weird thing for me to declare, but I grew up in a country where I did not have to worry when I walked out of my door that somebody would persecute me for my religious beliefs or for speaking out against the government or for disagreeing with my neighbor or anything like that. I didn't have those problems like many people do, and maybe some people in this room have had. That's a privilege. And I am no longer self-employed, which I'll get to in just a moment, but I have been employed. I've been gainfully employed, and that's also been a privilege. These are things that I declare are my own privilege awareness. And I would challenge you to think more deeply about those things as you go about your day-to-day lives and as you look to the people to your left and your right and ask, what is my own privilege, and how can I be more aware of that and be more inclusive of people around me? All right. Just a quick note about some things that I've done. Thank you. The first time I did that in a talk, a whole bunch of people came up and yelled at me and told me that I was wrong for doing so, and that's when I knew that it was the right thing to do. So I'm glad that you appreciate that. All right, so I've also written a series of books about JavaScript. Clearly, you know that I'm a JavaScript guy. The entire book series, 6 books, 1,100 pages, is available for free online at GitHub, the You Don't Know JS domain will redirect you to that. They've also been published through O'Reilly, so you can purchase those if you find them useful. And as I mentioned, I'm no longer self-employed. As of about 7 weeks ago, I am now head of curriculum for an engineer developer training program called Maker Square. We have 3 campuses, Austin, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and we will definitely be expanding. If any of you in this room are interested in developer training and engineer training and those sorts of boot camp programs, or you have thoughts or questions about it, I'd love for you to come up and ask or reach out to me online. And if you know somebody that's interested in trying to get in, we would love to talk to them, so come and find me about that. All right. So that stuff out of the way, let's get into the meat of this talk. In many ways, this talk is actually a story of 2 origami cranes. And I know this sounds a little bit silly, but it's kind of a heavier topic, and I wanted to at least have something lighter-hearted about it. So a story of these 2 cranes, the blue and the orange crane. And we're going to look at 2 different sides, 2 things that I think are fundamentally broken about the web that we have and the web that many of us in this room are responsible for having built. And I want to call attention to these things. And primarily the reason I want to call attention to them is flowing directly from the privilege awareness slide that I just showed. We are not building an inclusive web. And that is completely and totally unacceptable. And we need to fix it. So I'm going to talk about the things that I think are broken. All right, so the first one, I have in my mind this idealized version. This is obviously some vector on. I have in my mind this idealized version of the origami that I could do. When I was a kid, I played around with origami, and maybe I could do a few things like the crane or whatever. But in reality, if I tried today to do that, having not really honed any of those skills in decades, it would probably end up more like this, right? So there's a difference between the perception of my skill and the actual output of my skill. I love this one. So many times I think I got it right. I nailed it. When in practice, I didn't actually nail it. So this is a talk criticizing myself as much as anyone else. So don't feel like I'm trying to be too preachy. I'm really trying to speak to something that I think we need to be more aware of. This seems like a strange picture for me to show, but one of the things that I want to point out about the reason why you may not actually succeed in making the perfect origami is if you start with imperfect materials. I don't know if you've ever seen origami paper, but it is like the crispest, cleanest cut design that you could possibly get, and it comes in the special packaging and things like that. And yet we can start with something as crappy as this, folded up, messed up piece of paper and think that we're going to produce the same results as if you started with this high quality paper that's made specifically for that purpose, and you don't end up with the same end result. So that frames what I want to talk about first, where we are starting with building the web with things that are fundamentally not up to par. They're not enough. We're starting with bad material. So I love to call this the selfie unicorn. If you think about all of the decisions that went into making this happen, there were an awful lot of really bad decisions that were made. A bad decision in design of the product, but then this lady making the decision to buy it, and then making the decision that she needed to take a call while it was still connected. And I could go on and on. There are a lot of bad decisions here. Behind all the silliness, however, is I would say that the first of our problems with the web is that it has been broken by intentional decision. We have, as makers of the web, intentionally broken the thing that we have been trying to build. What do I mean by that? There is this notion of backwards compatibility. I want to spend a moment talking about backwards compatibility. And by the way, a lot of times people will use the term backwards compatibility, and the thing that they're describing is actually the opposite. It's actually forwards compatibility. So just as a real quick clarification for you, backwards compatibility means code that was written that worked in an old environment continues to run in a new environment. That's what backwards compatible means. Forwards compatible means code that was written in a new environment can still run in an old environment, at least partially. They are opposite notions, and we should not use the same term for both of them. So, for example, JavaScript itself is backwards compatible. Old JavaScript still runs in new engines, but new JavaScript does not run in old engines, and that means that JavaScript is backwards compatible, but not forwards compatible. By contrast, CSS and HTML are actually much more forgiving. They are both backwards compatible and forwards compatible. If you take the nav tag from HTML5 and run it in an old browser, the browser does not choke and say, I can't do anything with it. It simply ignores it. So just clarification here, backwards compatible versus forwards compatible. So backwards compatibility means stuff that we wrote 20 years ago has to continue to work the same way. It has to continue to work even today. And this is a great notion. It is part of the reason why the web has succeeded, but I'm going to advance that it is a terribly impractical notion. It's romantic. It's great that we say, no matter how long ago the code was written, it will continue to run, but it's entirely impractical. And not just impractical for what we've had in the past, where we're going in the future, but I understand that we needed some notion of this impracticality to get the web to where it is today. But the web is not fighting the same battles now that it was fighting in those early days in the late 90s, in the early 2000s. We're not fighting the same battles, which means we don't actually need to keep the same romantic but impractical notions. So let me talk about some of the things that we have done by decision to advance this idea of backwards compatibility, that we're going to keep these things around. The mistakes that we made 20 years ago continue to be on our plate even today. I'm not proud of the fact that this is code from an actual thing that I wrote. These are browser JavaScript hacks. These are inferences for different browsers using different weird things like the window.opera and other sorts of properties that would exist only in one browser because we need to fork some JavaScript behavior and do something weird and different. And for many years, this was the only way, it seems, to get the code to run correctly. But actually, that started from a fundamental misunderstanding that we allowed players outside of the industry to force upon us, was this idea that the web was ever designed to be exactly the same in all browsers and all versions. That's not the way this medium is, but we've allowed clients and bosses to convince us that we're building a pixel-perfect medium that works, looks, feels, and behaves exactly the same. So we went to all of this kind of crap to do it. And it was not just JavaScript, by the way. There were many others. This tweet is interesting, pointing out document.unique ID and window.opera. But obviously, that's not a good idea anymore, right? Because there isn't a window.opera anymore. So the inferences that we were making, that code doesn't exist, or it still exists, but doesn't work anymore. We also did this in the CSS world. And in fact, people were heralded as heroes of our industry when they came up with these crazy CSS hacks to target one specific browser, for example, an IE6 or an IE7 or something like that. Posts were made and they were lauded as heroes. We gave them awards for coming up with these things. I'm not even joking, it's true. But that stuff is our legacy that still holds on today. Not only the problems that the browsers made, the mistakes that they made, but all the crap that we put on top of it by decision. We chose to put broken stuff into the web, and that broken stuff is still holding us back today. They want to advance things, and there's so much code out there using the old crap that they can't. And whose fault is that? It is ours. We put that code there. We made those decisions. We thought we were getting really clever when we came up with conditional comments and we could target things, different style sheets. This same sort of thing was a legacy that was very painful when Microsoft announced they were finally going to get rid of it. It was extremely painful and lots of outcry like, oh, my whole site's going to break now because you don't have these conditional comments. This is the worst of all of them. This is a snippet of code that we used back in the day to simulate the document ready event in Internet Explorer that didn't have it, by setting up a scroll handler to listen for a scroll event because there was some weird condition where the scroll event was fired as soon as the document was ready, or some ridiculous thing like that. These kinds of hacks are not small in number, they are large in number, and they are widely across the web. This code was in jQuery. And guess how many copies of jQuery are still out there and are going to be there forever? Now, I'm not talking down on jQuery, but we made these decisions to put in this old legacy crap. And it is still haunting us even today. And then when we couldn't figure out how to hack around stuff, then what we started doing was shifting the blame from our own development and our own tools and technology to the user. We started blaming the user. How stupid you must be that you're still on Internet Explorer 7. This turned out to be a joke, but they actually are saying here that they were going to charge an additional tax to people who bought items from their site from IE7. It's just the worst of thousands of examples that I can show you about these banners that we put up, banners that basically said, I as a developer value my time more than the user's dignity. We turned it around on them and blamed them and said they must be stupid, they must be brain dead. And I'm using direct quotes from some of these. They must be brain dead to still be running on these old browsers. Does that sound like an inclusive web that we built to turn the blame on them instead of taking responsibility for ourselves? And I did this stuff, so I'm as much criticizing myself as anybody else. How many of you ever wrote code or ever had to deal with Netscape 4.7? Anybody in this room old enough to remember? Okay, good. I was hoping I wasn't that old that I would be the only one. Netscape 4.7 was the entry point to the web for millions and millions of people. Quick story. Years and years ago, I was building a website, the homepage for a major regional airline in the U.S. I was the lead JavaScript developer on this. And we were given 3 weeks, the 3 weeks immediately leading up to Christmas, to rebuild this whole homepage. And they'd already built out all the design with this fancy calendar widget stuff. This was back in 2004 when MooTool's calendar widget was super awesome. So they designed all of this stuff like accordions and calendar widgets, and they said, go build this new awesome web page. And halfway through, a week and a half into our 3 weeks, they came to us and said, oh, we forgot to mention that you have to support Netscape 4.7. And I literally almost fell out of my chair. I was like, you got to be kidding me. There's no possible way this stuff is going to run in Netscape 4.7. They had some kind of crazy statistic that said they still had 200,000 visits a month from Netscape 4.7, and that was in 2004, 2005. And that meant too much business for them to turn away. Now, I disagreed with it at the time. I said, it's probably not 200,000 real people. That's probably 200,000 bots that are using the Netscape 4.7 user agent. I still believe that to be true. But the fact of the matter is these stats that we get are about as reliable as the hacks that we've come up with. People have hacked those user agents into bots, and yet your bosses and your clients are making hard decisions, real decisions that cost real money based upon craziness like that. So I would advance this notion that the web is fundamentally broken, and it's in large part our faults. We made decisions along the way. We made easier decisions than the harder decisions to push back and say, we shouldn't be patting each other on the back and cheering for people that come up with horrible code. That should be seen as a temporary stopgap. And unfortunately, some of you may have heard this before, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary hack. Because we have this impractical, it's romantic but impractical notion that once something's been written, it has to stay that way forever. You see, this is a legacy that if we do not choose to break from, it is going to implode on itself. The web cannot continue at this pace, and speeding up with more and more features, the web components of the world, where we're just rushing to put all this stuff in, because every time we put something in, we've created more of this legacy. For some reason, we seem determined to keep it this way. We seem like a compulsive hoarder, like we have to keep all of this stuff because it's so frightening to us to imagine that we might have to tell some users in the world, guess what? You're going to get a degraded, broken, not perfect experience because the web has moved forward. And if you'd like to move with us, there's lots of great options for you. But I want to ask the question, do we have to? I tweeted this out at one point, do we really have to be stuck with stupid JavaScript bugs that we all know, including the founder of JavaScript himself, the creator, said, this is a bug, it's not supposed to be that way. So we know it's a bug, but you know why we can't fix it? Because there's too much code that relies upon the crap, and we break too many websites. Perhaps 20% of the web would break if they fixed that in JavaScript. Isn't that ridiculous? That we've hacked ourselves around these problems. Instead of insisting on fixing our tools, we praised ourselves for coming up with ridiculous workaround hacks. I want to spend a moment talking to you about something called browser game theory. Not sure if any of you have heard of this term before. It's kind of a term of art for those that are kind of more in the spec realm or at least read lists about the specification process. One of the biggest reasons why they cannot fix bugs is because there is this notion of browser game theory at play that is basically a force acting in stasis. It is a force trying to keep everything as stable as possible between the browsers. And the reason is because every single browser, regardless of the company who makes it, is desperate for your eyeballs. They want as many people using their browser by default as possible. They have different reasons for it. Google has a different reason than Microsoft, and Microsoft has a different reason than Mozilla, but they are all working under the same assumption that they can only get done what they want to do for the web if they have the most market share. They're desperate for it. So, imagine a scenario where Chrome or Mozilla or somebody said, there's something fundamentally broken about the web and we're going to fix it. And yes, that is going to break some sites, but it's the right thing to do. It's the ethical thing to do. It is the best, healthiest thing for us to do so that we can get rid of all that old baggage and move fresh forward. And imagine they did that and they did it single-handedly. So one day they just flipped on a whole bunch of changes which broke a bunch of sites that were relying upon all these hacks. What should happen is that we should all outcry to those sites and say, hey, you're broken, you need to update yourselves. And by the way, browsers, why aren't you other browsers keeping up with this? That's the path forward. But you know what will happen? Is everybody will take whoever that browser is and skewer them alive and say, how could you break 20% of the web? What are you thinking? And in mass, people would switch to whatever other browser did not break the web for them. This is what we call browser game theory. It's a force to keep things stable because they are prohibited based upon their the drive that they build the browser for. They're prohibited from making a change that would lose users. They won't do it. So this seems like kind of an impossible thing to break, right? I tweeted that out and I got back an answer from one of the developers at Internet Explorer, and he said it's appealing, but we'd never be able to do it. What implementation would be willing to stick their neck out and lose users? And my response, which becomes the basis of this part of the talk, is, well, we did something kind of interesting in Y2K for those of you that are around. We had a moment in time where we knew that stuff was going to break regardless of what we did. So in advance of it for years, we fixed everything. As shocking as that sounds, we actually worked together to fix stuff. And there was a whole cottage industry that spun up of developers that did nothing but go into companies, look through all their crappy legacy code, and fix all their date logic. So why couldn't we do that for the web? Why couldn't we declare an arbitrary point in the future that we're going to break the web forward? And this is a little microsite that I launched, an international day that I arbitrarily pick, where in advance of it, we know that browsers are going to fix a bunch of crap, and it is our responsibility as a community to fix the code so that it's ready to go when they flip the switch. Now, I know that sounds entirely unlikely to ever happen, and it probably is entirely unlikely to ever happen. It sounds crazy. Except on a very, very small scale, it's already kind of happening, which is pretty cool. At a very, very small scale, there's one particular bug that the browsers have already decided they're going to fix, and it probably won't affect any of your sites. It has some weird thing to do with how they handle control characters, which I don't even know what those are. But some weird way that they've all been doing it wrong forever, and they've all agreed there's some arbitrary date in October of this year that they're all going to flip a switch and this change is going to happen. And yes, it's going to break some websites. But you know what happens when they all do it at the same time? When they do it simultaneously, it destroys browser game theory because now there's no browser to blame. You can't take a user away from Chrome and go to Firefox because it's going to still be broken there. So if they coordinate, they can eliminate the problem or that pressure of this browser game theory. So really what I'm suggesting is we should declare many of these. And I hope maybe this website and this notion can catch on. I'm trying desperately to get people to catch on to this idea. We should have many of these. We should declare these arbitrary break the web forward days and fix stuff and stop with this romantic but impractical notion of backwards compatibility. All right. That's one thing that I would say. The web has been broken by decision. But if we switch mindset now to the second one, to the blue crane, if you will. And I deliberately chose this picture of the blue crane because it's a line drawing rather than a picture of the origami. And the line drawing is much simpler, but it still gets the point across. You still know that we're talking about an origami crane. But it's much simpler and much more based down to the point. And that's the theme for the second part of what I'll talk about today. The web has been broken by design. Also our fault, and I apologize if you feel like I'm beating up on us, but it's kind of like a shared therapy session. We got to go through all this stuff so that we can move forward. So broken by design. I want to tell you a quick little story. 5 years ago or so, when I was early in the conference circuit, I went over to Poland to speak at a conference, fantastic conference over there called Front Trends. And I did not have, at the time, I had a smartphone, quote unquote, but I did not have a good international data carrier or whatever. And so I knew I don't want to be on international data plan or whatever. So I was at the conference venue, and I switched on, or I thought I switched on Wi-Fi to connect to the conference Wi-Fi. And I loaded the CNN.com homepage one time. Took forever. And I later found out that that one load of this web page was more than a megabyte and cost me US $23 for one load of a website. Because I wasn't on the Wi-Fi, I was on this crappy international data plan. Now let me tell you another story. Years and years ago, I had an opportunity, it was a privilege, to go and visit a very small village in the middle of Botswana, Africa. And I spent 3 weeks in this area, meeting with people and talking with people and doing some service projects and things like that. And there was a town, I wish I remember the name of the town, but there was a town there that people were in, and I asked them in this town, I said, how much do you make in a year? And when I did the equivalent, they made about 17 US dollars as an annual salary. And this was years ago. Obviously, it's probably different now. But years ago, they made about $17. So if you just calibrate that, it costs about a year and a third salary for somebody in that village to open up the CNN homepage one time. You see, the problem is that we are building a web that is hopelessly overbloated by our addiction to needless features. And I know that's going to offend some people, especially the designers in the room, who love all of this great stuff that we've invented. But there's an awful lot of that that's been bloating. This is a fantastic tool. What does my site cost? You should definitely go and check this out. You load up your website, and it actually estimates how much somebody paid to load that page in different parts of the world, in real, actual dollars. You want to have some eye-opening. Somebody pays 60, 70 cents just to load your one page? That's crazy. Just a few months ago, for the first time, the average page weight size increased above 2 megabytes. 2 megabytes of stuff. And the vast majority of it, as you can see on the screen, the vast majority of it is images. We're stuffing down these crazy big retina images and all these things because we're addicted to all of these amazing features, and we think that we can create these amazing experiences for users. And it's true, when you have an awesome device with unlimited fast bandwidth and a full charge on your battery, and you're in a place where you don't have to pay for that bandwidth, it is true that you can give them a great experience. But for most of the world, it actually kind of looks like this. I love this picture because we have these giant boats that we need to get somewhere. So what do? We make an even more giant boat to take the boats around. And I bet in a few years, they're going to make an even bigger boat for those big boats that are carrying the big boats. This is what I see when I see the web. I see us building bigger and bigger boats to carry bigger and bigger boats from one place to another. Hopelessly bloating. And it doesn't matter to you when you're on your local network at work, but it matters to a user in some country like India or Africa. But let me bring that a little bit closer to home. It matters to you when you're in some place, like for example, you are in a foreign country and you're paying a lot for the bandwidth on your data plan, and you only have 2% battery life left on your battery, and you're at a bus stop and it's about to rain and you need the bus schedule. Are you at all concerned about stuff like WebGL animations of the city? Or do you just want the data? You see, it's not just about people living in parts of the world that it's easy for us to forget. It's about us being in a different environment than we are normally building the web in. And we are not thinking enough about that as we build this web. I love this. Eric Mary said, this is the best way to do it. Require all web teams to develop from hotels on the hotel Wi-Fi. How true is that? Right? We'd have a much different web if everybody had to build on a hotel Wi-Fi. By the way, you don't have to go to a hotel Wi-Fi. Your Chrome developer tools have built in this feature that you can artificially limit the speed of the connection and see how your sites behave. And I promise you, if you do that, you're going to have a very different view of the kind of web that you're building. I encourage all of you to try that. This is a true story. I was in the UK a couple of months ago doing a training, and I had gone out to this rural area in Western UK, and I was on a train back to London. And the train ticket that I had bought was from this company, thetrainline.com. So I was on their train, on their train's Wi-Fi, loading their train's website. And I want to zoom in here so you can see 57.97 seconds for DOM ready event and 2.2 minutes for the full load of this page. And look how many requests. Let me back up. Look how many requests. 256 requests, 1.3 megabytes. I'm going to talk about a painful experience. That's the kind of experience that we're building for the web because, oh, it's fancy. We can use custom fonts. I was digging in. They had all kinds of weird custom fonts and crap. Remember that village in Africa? Another important thing that you should know about that. This is not an actual picture, but it is going to give you something in your mind when you hear this part of the story. They had one electricity pole in the center of the village. About 5,000 people lived in this village. There was one electricity pole with a line, not unlike what you see in the picture, coming to this electricity pole, and literally hundreds of cell phone chargers hanging, with the phones hanging below them, hanging off of this telephone pole, because the amount of electricity that they were getting there, it would take days to get a full charge on their phone. So people would just leave their phone for days on end to get this electricity, because that's the only electricity to the entire village. So this is not just about bandwidth. This is also about our wrong assumption that people have unlimited battery power. Well, if we take some of their battery power away because we did a WebGL animation that they didn't give a care about, that's no big deal. They can just recharge. Except there's an awful lot of the world that can't. And if you go to a foreign country and you've forgotten one of your adapters or there's some kind of crazy crap that won't plug in, you're in the same boat. You can't recharge. This happened to me. I landed in India and I had forgotten the adapter. So I had this like 30 some odd hours of flying and my computer was nearly entirely dead. And I panicked thinking, oh my God, I have to be here for 10 days and I have no way to recharge. This happens, okay? So it's not just about unlimited fast bandwidth, it's also about the web. And the web that we built is just totally, it's screwed up. It's messed up. And it's our fault. But it doesn't mean that we can't fix it. There are things that we can do to fix it. Progressive enhancement is a fantastic idea. The problem is we stop way too short. We should be progressively enhancing not just the initial page load, but the entire experience for a user. Because they may open up your web app when they have 100% battery power, and then come back to it when they have 2% battery power. And you should be progressively enhancing that experience, not just the initial page load. Same thing with responsive design. Fantastic idea. Stopped way too short because all we cared about with responsive design is the screen size. We didn't care about any of the rest of the conditions on that device, like the battery power and the bandwidth and all of those other things that affect the user experience. So these things are great, but they point to something much bigger. And I'm not even going to try to coin some kind of great word for this. But we need to build a more inclusive web that is constantly monitoring these experiences and giving people good experiences, not just the best experience that we can design in one particular scenario. Feature tests. Yeah, if you listen at all to me, I'm always banging the cymbal on feature tests are awesome. We got to do more feature tests. I'm giving a conference talk tomorrow about feature tests. They're awesome. But you know one problem with feature tests? They have a fundamentally broken assumption. And that broken assumption is that if the device can do it, the user wants it. We feature test for something, and if it's possible to do, we assume that they want it. The fact of the matter is they probably don't. They might sometimes want it. It's the story of Opera Mini had come in and proxied down the Facebook application and had given them this simpler version of the Facebook application, and millions of people had become accustomed to that. And then one day they switched it and they upgraded that Facebook app to this more sophisticated one, and all of their users started yelling at them saying, give us the simple one back. Because users actually like simple and fast. Not to say that they can't be delighted by great stuff that we come up with, but they also are many times in cases where they like the other. They like the better, the stripped down to the basic sort of experience. So we need to give users more control. Now, my best, most visible example I can give you to kind of point the way towards what I'm talking about is Gmail. Have any of you ever seen this link down in the bottom that says, load the basic HTML version of Gmail? I can't tell you how many times I use this when I'm on crappy Wi-Fi's in other countries. because it actually gives you a pretty good experience. You can still do your email, but there's not all of that other stuff, and it loads much quicker, and it doesn't crash all the time like it does sometimes on bad... Well, they just have a simple user choice that lets a user pick if they want a more stripped down experience. Does it take them time and effort to create this forked version of the application? Absolutely. And I know many of you are jumping to the conclusion, this is all great in theory, but there's no possible way that I could ever have time to build multiple versions of my site. Just hang on, because I have a way to suggest moving forward with that. But it's at least an example where we're giving users back the choice. And isn't that the best way to build an inclusive web? Is let the user pick what they want, not what some designer and developer in some perfect scenario came up with? Isn't that the most inclusive web? And I love this. They actually monitored my situation, and they saw that when I initially loaded it, it was great to have the old one. And then they monitored it, and they said, hey, by the way, you kind of got a crappy bandwidth connection right now. Maybe you'd like to switch to the simpler one. So they monitored that, and they popped this up and said, would you like to switch to the other version? That's the kind of thing that delighted me. Not whether you had the rounded corners and the WebGL animations and the custom fonts. Because they cared about my experience. I love this quote. It's used way too many times in conference talks, but I love this quote. Perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. Isn't that the essence of this? Couldn't we come up with, and this is going to be a different answer for every one of your sites and applications, but couldn't we come up with that essence, that perfection where there's nothing left to take away? And couldn't that be the starting point for experiences? And couldn't we layer on things that users get to choose whether they want or not want? Isn't that possible? Couldn't we build the web that way? We didn't build the web that way. But couldn't we start building the web that way? Some of you may have heard of the priority of constituencies, but if you haven't heard of this, you should go and look up, and the link is right there if you go back to my slides. The priority of constituencies. In case of conflict, consider users over authors, over implementers, over specifiers, over theoretical purity. At the very beginning, the very highest priority should be the user. This is in the HTML specification. When did we lose sight of that? When did we decide that us developers were at the top of the constituency list? So I built another microsite called Unsuck the Web. And I've declared what I call the Unsucked Web Manifesto. This notion that we need to restore user choice to the way that we build the web. That needs to be a fundamental underpinning of every single thing that we build and deploy. Now, I'm not going to actually take any time, but just in case you wanted to go back to the slides, all the text is here of this Unsucked Web Manifesto, or you can go to the website and check it out. And I may not have it perfect. If you have thoughts on how to make this better, please feel free to reach out. But I'm trying to put my foot down and say, can't we make something better for this web? Can't we make something more inclusive? Can't we make something that doesn't suck so much? So actually, ironically, my vision for the future is that maybe websites could start like this. And then they could be enhanced as the user chooses, or not enhanced as the user doesn't choose. Now, how are we going to do that? I do not have a perfect answer here, but this is one possible thing that a whole bunch of people in this room are probably going to want to bike shit on. But here's a mobile web browser thing. You know, I just grabbed the screenshot off the web. This is a mobile web browser, right? Everybody knows this. How could we let somebody on a mobile device choose whether they want the full experience or something stripped down? How can we do that in a simple enough way that they're not going to be overwhelmed, that they're not going to get confused, but they're still going to have the authority to say, this is the experience that I want at this moment? How could we do that? Well, what if we just gave them a slider? And it stays where they set it until they change it. And maybe it stays at the right-hand side by default that they want everything. But if they're in a really crappy scenario, maybe they can just move the slider down and say, I am saying in a very non-specific way that I want less of that experience, because it's actually going to be more of an experience for me if you can strip it down and make it better for me. And maybe that means that it's sending information from the browser to the server that says, hey, they don't want custom fonts, and hey, they don't want Retina images, and hey, they don't want WebGL, regardless of what your feature test says. So if we give the users the choice, then they have that ability to say, this is what I want at any given moment. And if they go back to a great experience, then they can slide it back up to the everything experience and get everything that you came up with. So maybe it's 2, maybe it's 3, maybe that's a spectrum, and then you just decide for your site what you do with the number. I don't know. But there's like a low, medium, and high maybe is the starting point. And low means fast, please. Medium means I'm patient. And high means I want all the features. Right? I don't know what we call it. And I don't even know what it looks like, honestly. I'm not a designer. But I think it's possible for us to give users some fundamental basic choice back into this equation. And the most important key is that the browser has to enforce that user choice. The browser has to say, even if I've told you that this is what the user said, if you violate it and start sending me all this crap that they don't want, I'm going to cut it off and say, I'm not even going to download it. It's not like I'm going to download it and not display it, because then they've paid the bandwidth and CPU penalty. I'm simply going to stop downloading any image after 75K, so don't even send it to me because I'm not going to finish loading. Right? We could do these sorts of things. We could figure stuff out that would improve user experience for everybody. And you're probably thinking this is even crazier, because now you're talking about changing the way we build the web, right? This is nuts, and changing every browser, and it's never going to happen, right? Except this is already sort of happening. Kind of. There is a proposal for a thing called client hints. And it started out as client hints about things like the size of your screen so that we could do server-side responsive design. But there's a proposal to add additional information in there. For example, there's a request quality setting. And there's a proposal, and Chrome is working on adding RQ low, which is the user, by some way, telling the browser to tell the server, I want low-quality resources. So the header is already there. They're already working on it in principle. We just need to figure out some way to expose that to users. And that's the bug if anybody wants to go and check that out and follow along. So what is our part in this deal? We are going to have to build more of the web in layers. And yes, that is a joke, the layer back from Netscape 4.7, if anybody remembers building with those. I certainly did. We're going to have to build the web in layers. You're going to have to build the web in tolerant layers. That is, that your application does not completely fall down if the top layer just doesn't show up for a user. Maybe that's you have a social application and the chat widget doesn't get loaded if that highest level isn't chosen. And maybe you have an image drawing program and you load only the basic set of brushes and textures, and then you let a user choose to load all the additional stuff if they want it. And it's going to look entirely different for every one of your situations. But I am positive that there is a way for you to build a progressive application that still delights users. It will be difficult for some of you, and I fully recognize that. I'm not saying this is easy. I'm saying this is the way to build a more inclusive web. So I started with unsuck the web. And if you send that RQ low header, you get just the text. How shocking is that? You still get the most important part of the website. You don't get all those fancy SVG graphics, but you get the most important part of the web. So I know there's a bunch of objections, and I'm going to wrap up here pretty quickly. I know there's a bunch of objections that people have, and I could probably do in another whole day's worth of talks and addressing different ways to think about these objections. But I just want to call a couple of them out. Some of you work as consultants for clients, and your client is never going to pay you to do this, is what you'll say. There's no possible way the client's ever going to pay me. My response is, you should spin it back to the client. Actually, if you pay me to build this in this way, you are going to have an uncommonly high level of user satisfaction that will separate you from all of your peers. I have the ability to build a layered application that tailors itself to your users and gives them more choice than any of your competitors do. And you can get that for not all that much more money, right? So there is a way to have these conversations and spin it back to the positive and to the ethical thing, which is how we ought to be building the web. Oh, but my boss will say no. And that's absolutely true. You'll have this conversation 100 times with your boss, and 99 times your boss is going to say, that's all well and good, but you still just have 4 hours to build it. Got to get the feature out the door, right? Because they don't, I'm not trying to be mean to bosses, but they don't speak our language, right? So, your boss is going to say no, but the one time that he says yes would not have happened if you hadn't pushed back. oh, it's too much work. And I'm not even going to go into that. But yeah, it's more work. But actually, it's a better way to build applications anyway, to think about stuff in independent layers. It's more proper architecturally. So we need to build the minimal experience that a user needs and build the best experience that we can come up with and let the user decide. That's how we build a more inclusive web. So we have to break from the web of the past and break from the web of the current, because that better future web is just over the edge waiting for us. Thanks very much for listening.